The silence in the house felt strange. For the first time, Daniel was completely alone. His parents had gone away for a weekend retreat, leaving him in charge of the house. He should have been excited. After all, who wouldn't want 2 whole days with no one around to give orders? But there was something unsettling about the situation. Before they left, his parents handed him a folded note, their faces serious, with a strange insistence that he follow every single instruction. "Daniel, you need to promise you'll follow this to the letter. It's really important." He had rolled his eyes at the time, thinking it was just another one of their attempts to maintain control from afar. But now, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the note between his fingers, he felt an uncomfortable chill run down his spine. Slowly, he unfolded the paper and read the list. House rules. 1. Lock all doors and windows before sunset. No exceptions. 2. Don't look out the window after midnight, no matter what you see or hear. 3. If you hear someone calling your name, ignore it. 4. Never let the phone ring more than 3 times before answering. 5. If the TV turns on by itself, don't try to turn it off. Leave the room and wait. 6. Never, under any circumstances, look at your reflection in the mirror for too long at night. 7. If you wake up and notice something is different in the house, pretend you haven't noticed. Daniel furrowed his brow and let out a short, disbelieving laugh. Seriously? What do they think is going to happen? The list seemed more like a psychological game than a real set of rules. Why would anyone worry about such ridiculous things? But at the same time, there was something unsettling about the list. The way it was written, the urgency in his parents' words before they left. Something didn't feel right. Still holding the note, he glanced at the clock on the wall. 7:45 p.m. The sun was already setting. He sighed, deciding that at least he'd follow the first rule, just to be safe. He stood up, locked the doors, and closed all the windows, but left his bedroom window slightly open. The warm night breeze would be welcome. The rest of the night went by normally. He had frozen pizza, watched a few videos on his phone, and played video games until his eyes grew heavy. The note still sat on the kitchen table, forgotten. However, just before going to bed, something bothered him. A low, dragging sound. It was as if something was moving inside the house. The sound was almost imperceptible, like the slow dragging of something heavy across the floor. Daniel froze. The game controller was still in his hands, but his attention was no longer on the screen. He held his breath, trying to listen more closely. The house was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the TV. The sound seemed to be coming from downstairs, near the kitchen. His parents had left hours ago. He was sure he'd locked all the doors. So, what could be moving down there? It must be the house settling. He tried to convince himself, but his heart was racing. He took a deep breath and stood up. He wasn't a kid anymore. He wasn't afraid of the dark, let alone random sounds. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight. Slowly, he made his way down the stairs, his footsteps making the wood creak slightly. When he reached the kitchen, the note with the rules was still on the table, motionless. Everything seemed the same. No sign of anything out of the ordinary. But then he noticed it. The back door was unlocked. A chill ran down his spine. He was absolutely sure he had locked it before sunset. He even twisted the doorknob to check and heard the click of the latch. But now, it was open. Daniel swallowed hard and looked around. The silence in the house felt suffocating. He hesitantly reached out and closed the door again, locking it. He turned to leave the kitchen and head back to his room, but something made his body freeze. The reflection in the glass of the door wasn't right. It was him, facing away, as it should be. But the reflection took a second longer to move. Daniel blinked, his heart pounding. Maybe he imagined it. Maybe it was just a sleepiness. He decided it was late and quickly climbed the stairs, throwing himself in the bed and covering himself up to his head. If he had paid more attention at that moment, he would have seen it. In the glass of the kitchen door, his reflected version was still staring in his direction and smiling. Daniel's room was shrouded in dimness, the only light coming from the bluish glow of the video game still flickering on the TV screen. His heart pounded in his chest, but he tried to ignore the growing discomfort spreading through his body. He rolled over in bed and pulled the blanket up to his chin. "It was just in my head," he repeated to himself. Maybe he was tired. Maybe it was just a weird shadow. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Time passed, and the house fell silent again. No noise, no explanation for what had happened downstairs. He felt restless, but sleep began to overtake him. His eyes slowly closed. Knock, knock, knock. Daniel snapped his eyes open. The sound came from the bathroom. He lay still, his heart racing. The bathroom was at the end of the hall, right next to his room. Knock, knock. It was as if someone was lightly knocking on the mirror. Daniel took a deep breath and slowly got up, his bare feet touching the cold floor. He grabbed his phone and turned the flashlight back on. The hallway seemed darker than usual. Each step he took seemed to echo through the house. When he reached the bathroom door, he hesitated. The silence now felt heavier, almost as if it were waiting for him. With a quick motion, he turned the doorknob and opened the door. The mirror was fogged up, as if someone had recently taken a shower. But he was alone. Daniel slowly approached, extending his hand and running his fingers over the cold glass. The steam began to dissipate, revealing his reflected image. But something was wrong. The reflection blinked a second after he did. Daniel's stomach churned. He took a step back, but his reflection remained still. Panic spread through his body when he realized something even worse. The reflection was smiling. He wasn't. The smile of the reflection was wide wrong. Its eyes were dark, too deep. And then it moved on its own. Daniel watched as his own hand in the mirror lifted, but he wasn't moving. The reflection pressed its palm against the glass. Knock, knock. Daniel took a step back, but his reflected image didn't retreat. It just tilted its head to the side, as if studying him. Its eyes were dark, lifeless, and then he heard it, a low, raspy voice coming from inside the mirror. "You shouldn't have broken the rules." Daniel's heart nearly stopped. He stumbled backward and ran out of the bathroom, slamming the door behind him. He sprinted to his room and locked the door, his breath ragged. He curled up on the bed, pulling the blanket over his face as if it could protect him. He didn't know what was happening. He only knew one thing. That thing in the mirror wasn't him. And now, he wasn't alone anymore. His breathing came too fast, cold sweat dripping down his forehead. He kept his eyes fixed on the locked door, as if that could stop his reflection from leaving the mirror. He wanted to believe he was imagining it all, but he wasn't. The room seemed darker than before, as if the darkness itself was creeping closer to him. The silence was unbearable, pressing against his ears like an invisible weight. Then, the silence was broken. Tap, tap, tap. Daniel froze. The sound came from under the bed. It sounded like nails tapping against the wooden floor. He gripped the blanket tighter. The voice in his head screamed at him not to look, to pretend nothing was happening. But he heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. And then a voice whispered, "Daniel." The air caught in his throat. "I know you're there." The voice was low, raspy, and seemed to come from right beneath the bed. Daniel wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything, but his body was frozen. His blood pounded in his ears. Then he felt something, a cold touch on his ankle. It was as if a block of ice had brushed against him, and terror flooded his entire body. In a desperate movement, he pulled his legs up, curling into the center of the bed. The touch disappeared, but the voice kept going. "You shouldn't have broken the rules, Daniel." He squeezed his eyes shut, wishing to wake up from this nightmare. But this wasn't a dream. Suddenly, The bed shook violently. The feet of the bed scraped against the floor, making an awful noise. Daniel gripped the mattress tightly, trying not to fall. Then, everything stopped. The silence returned. Daniel remained still for several seconds. The room seemed normal again, but he knew he wasn't alone. His heart pounding in his chest, he gathered the courage to move. Slowly, he slid his hand to the edge of the bed and grabbed his phone. With trembling fingers, he turned on the flashlight and pointed it downward. The beam of light illuminated the floor. Empty. Nothing there. Daniel felt a brief moment of relief, until he noticed something. The blanket that had been hanging off the side of the bed seemed slightly raised, as if something had just dragged itself into it. And then he heard the voice again. "I'm down here, just waiting for you to look." Daniel threw the phone away and screamed. He was paralyzed. His body wanted to run, but terror sank invisible claws into his muscles, preventing any movement. That thing was under the bed, and it knew he was there. The light from the phone, which now lay on the floor, still illuminated the empty space. But Daniel knew there was something there, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. He tried to think. What should he do? Stay still? Run? But if he ran, it could grab him by the ankles. The voice returned, but this time, it didn't come from under the bed. It came from the mirror. Daniel, slowly, he turned his head. His reflection was there, but something wasn't right. His eyes in the mirror were empty, dark, like two endless shadows. His face was way too pale, and there was a smile on it that he definitely wasn't making. Daniel backed up against the wall, feeling the mattress sink under his weight. You shouldn't have broken the rules. The reflection blinked. It blinked on its own. The Daniel in the mirror lifted his hand and pressed it against the glass from the inside. A faint crackling sound echoed, like the glass was starting to crack. Daniel felt the pressure in his chest rise. His heart was beating too fast, and the adrenaline was burning through his veins. He couldn't stay there. He had to get out of that room. With a burst of movement, he jumped out of bed and ran to the door. He yanked the doorknob hard, trying to open it. Locked. No. He pulled, pushed, but the door wouldn't budge. The mirror began to crack. Daniel looked over his shoulder. The glass was shaking, and dark cracks were spreading like veins. His reflection was now still, watching him with an empty gaze. The smile was gone. "Let me out," the reflection whispered. Daniel squinted, trying to ignore the voice. But then he heard another sound. Something was crawling across the floor. Behind him. He didn't want to look. He couldn't look. But then something grabbed his ankle. Cold, thin fingers, way too long. And it pulled. Daniel hit the floor hard. The air was knocked out of his lungs when he slammed against the wooden ground. And then something started dragging him under the bed. He kicked, thrashed, tried to grab anything he could. His nails scraped the floor, but those pale hands held on tight. He was pulled further and further down, and just before he could scream, the mirror shattered. 1,000 shards of glass flew across the room, and Daniel vanished. The house fell silent. The bedroom door was unlocked now. The mirror, whole again, reflected an empty room, and inside the glass, Daniel's reflection stared back. Trapped on the other side, Daniel opened his eyes. The room looked the same, but it wasn't. Everything was covered in a thin darkness, like a shadow filter over the world. The colors were faded. The furniture looked warped, and the air was heavy, damp, wrong. He tried to move, but his body felt lighter, almost insubstantial. That's when he realized he was no longer in his world. He was on the other side of the mirror. Panic surged up his throat. He turned to the mirror and saw his normal room on the other side of the glass. The real room, the real one. And there, where he should have been, someone else was in his place. The other Daniel. His reflection was now in the real world. It moved, looked around, as if getting used to the new body. Daniel hit the glass. Hey, hey, get out of there. Let me out. The reflection slowly turned its head and smiled. But you didn't follow the rules. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. The other Daniel approached the mirror and pressed his hand against the glass. For a moment, his eyes filled with something dark, like an endless void. Now it's my turn to live. Daniel punched the mirror, trying to break it, but it felt like he was hitting stone. On the other side, the imposter stepped back, grabbed Daniel's phone, and started typing a message. To his parents. Daniel felt despair tighten in his chest. What was he saying? Whatever it was, his parents would believe it. The voice, the face, the way of acting. It was identical to his. No one would ever realize the real Daniel was trapped here. He turned around, trying to find an escape. But this world was just a distorted version of his own room, with dark shadows moving in the corners, whispering his name. He needed to get out of there. He needed to follow the rules. If there was a way to escape, it would be in that damn list. He rushed to the desk and opened the drawer. There it was, the crumpled paper with the rules he'd ignored. His hands trembled as he read. 1. Lock all doors and windows before it gets dark. 2. Do not answer the doorbell after 10 p.m. 3. Do not look under the bed after midnight. 4. If you hear your own voice calling, ignore it. 5. Never look directly at the mirror in the dark. 6. If you break any of these rules, the paper was torn. The last instruction was incomplete. Daniel felt a knot tighten in his throat. What now? Behind him, something moved. A shadow slithered across the ceiling, long and shapeless, its edges pulsating as if it were alive. He wasn't alone in this place. Daniel couldn't stay still. He needed to find a way out of there. He looked at the mirror again. The other Daniel was wearing his favorite hoodie and leaving the room, taking over his life. Daniel clenched his fists. He couldn't let this happen. He needed to figure out the last rule, and fast. Daniel felt panic tightening around his throat. The other Daniel was already outside the room, ready to become him, ready to erase his real existence. But there was something even worse. The shadow behind him was moving. It was slow, dragging, as if savoring every second. He didn't want to look, but he could feel his body freeze at the presence of whatever was lurking there. You broke the rules. The voice was a torn whisper, as if the darkness itself was speaking to him. He needed to find the last rule. Looking at the drawer, he frantically rummaged through the papers. Nothing. The torn piece wasn't there. But then he remembered the bathroom trash. The paper had been torn and crumpled when he decided to ignore everything. If it was still there, it might contain the last rule, the key to escaping this nightmare. Daniel shot out of the room, his feet barely touching the ground. The hallway was distorted, as if the walls were pulsing and breathing. The floor creaked, but there was no wood there, only an endless black void. He needed to focus. He had to remember the real house and not lose himself in this place. He ran to the bathroom. The door was slightly ajar, but something was holding the doorknob from the other side. Daniel hesitated. Let me out. I just need the paper. Silence. He yanked the door open with force. Nothing. Then something slid across the floor. An arm, pale, skeletal, with fingers far too long. He could see the bones beneath the torn skin in some places. The hand crawled toward the trash can and grabbed the crumpled paper. Daniel felt a knot in his stomach. If he wanted that rule, he'd have to take it from the creature. Give it back, please. The hand stopped, and slowly, it lifted the paper toward him. Daniel extended his hand, hesitant, and snatched the paper in one swift motion. The whole arm twitched in spasms and disappeared into the dark. Daniel didn't wait to see what came next. He ran. The paper was torn and dirty, but the last rule was there. 6. If you break any of these rules, to leave, you must replace what came in your place. Daniel felt his stomach churn. He needed to get the other Daniel out of there and put him back. But how? He ran back to the room and stared at the mirror. The other Daniel was in the living room, sitting on the couch as if getting used to the body. Daniel pounded on the glass. "Hey, I know the final rule. You need to go back." The reflection turned its head, a satisfied smile crossing its face. "I know, but I'm not going." Desperation overtook Daniel. If he didn't do something fast, he'd be stuck there forever. He closed his eyes and thought. If the mirror was a passage, then he needed to reverse the process. He had to trick the entity. Taking a deep breath, he pressed his forehead against the glass and whispered, "I accept. I want to switch places." The other Daniel furrowed his brow. "What?" Daniel smiled, despite the fear gnawing at him. "I want to switch places. I accept the trade. You can stay." The imposter hesitated, and then something grabbed his ankle. The shadow that had been stalking Daniel seized the other Daniel. His eyes widened. "No, this isn't what I..." Before he could finish the sentence, the thing yanked his body back into the mirror, and Daniel felt an impact in his chest. He was sucked back into the real world. When he opened his eyes, he was on the floor of his room. The house was normal. The reflection in the mirror was his again. Daniel gasped, sweating cold. He looked at the drawer. The list of rules was still there, intact, as if nothing had ever happened, but he knew it had, and he knew he would never break another rule again. Outside, he heard the sound of the front door unlocking. His parents were back. Daniel looked at the mirror one last time, and he saw it, a shadow, far in the back. The entity was still there, and now it knew his name.